up, everyone? Welcome to Let's Talk Markets with Dave Lauer. I am your co-host, Pink, and today we are kicking off season 3 by welcoming James Tierney, who is an assistant professor at Chicago-Kent College of Law. He's also taught at the University of Nebraska and Rutgers Law School. Before teaching, he worked as a staff attorney for 5 years at the SEC's Office of General Counsel, and before that was an appellate litigator and agency comment letter writer on K Street. He teaches and researches on retail investors, financial advice, and stock market regulation. So, James, thank you for joining us. And if you don't mind, you can tell us a little about where you see yourself in the realm of market reform. And also, can you confirm or deny whether you were the one that hacked the SEC's Twitter over the weekend?
No, but they should really have put some two-factor authentication onto like the Twitter login, right? Also, bad for the SEC, bad form for them to still be on X at this, or Twitter, whatever, at this late date. I do think it's kind of funny that the SEC like is even on Twitter at all. You could see like an enforcement or an examinations reason to do that, but they seem to take seriously, their public education mission. And like I always found kind of funny and charming Gary Gensler's like fireside chats about like, don't fall prey to the crypto scam, people.
A lot of people are for that, but it's endearing, right?
We've hosted 2 Twitter spaces with Gary Gensler, so it's good that they stay on. Gary, don't listen to him.
No, he's a real fan. So he missed his second calling as an actor, I think.
I'd love to see him meme himself. He's not afraid to meme himself and join in poking fun at everything. So making light of it. So
that's kind of like the Ajit Pai, who was at the FCC in the Trump administration. I think that was like, he was very much about like, memeing himself, to better or less effect, I think. But you asked about kind of where I see myself in the realm of market reform. I guess I approach this as a securities lawyer by training, but someone who's kind of skeptical about kind of how we're doing the project of like capital markets regulation. And so, I have, I guess, the insider perspective and like institutional perspective on some of the things we'll talk about today. But also I kind of think of myself as more kind of in the Occupy Wall Street sort of camp of securities regulation.
Yeah, you're going to fit in just fine here.
Yeah, you can sit with us. That's fine.
What do you mean by that? That you're skeptical of how we regulate capital markets? I think that's a good place to start. Not to bite off too much.
Yeah. I guess the main part of the claim, without like getting into too much of the weeds, is securities law has this set of commitments or like policy goals that it's trying to implement. And these are like statutory policy goals, right? Investor protection, the public interest, which includes capital formation, fair and efficient market, orderly markets, promotion of competition in the national market system. And like those are all kind of incommensurable goals. Like you can't optimize for all of them. Optimizing for investor protection and like actually even defining investor protection, who you're talking about. Are we talking about like institutional? Are we talking about retail? Are we talking about like the average investor in both of those categories and then trying to like, smooth out the differences, right? All of these, I think, make kind of complicated the project of figuring out how we're going to navigate some of those trade-offs, especially in areas that I think are particularly prone to capture market structure regulation, right? Where it's not salient to ordinary people. Like people don't think about, people don't talk about.
Sure. Nobody has cared for a long time, and now it's great that people care. But for years and years, this would never, even when. If you go back to 2014, for example, when Flash Boys came out and, you had the guys from IEX on 60 Minutes, and suddenly that was as close as the public ever came to getting at anything having to do with market structure. And it went away. Popular interest went away so quickly. It was relatively shocking, I thought.
Yeah. And I think that, that reflects the the kind of importance of like narratives. Robert Shiller at Yale has like this whole idea about how like economics is driven in part by narratives, and I think that's partly true with respect to kind of the IEX formation, right? That it was there was a big public interest in that. I don't want to say solely, but like partly boosted by like Michael Lewis's attention to that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And in the same way that, a few years ago, we got the rise of commission-free trading and like the emergence of Robinhood as like a serious kind of broker-dealer option at the beginning of the pandemic. And all of a sudden, everyone really started talking about, the problems with, payment for order flow or whatever. And these were things that, you would never talk about kind of in the media. And so I guess getting back to that earlier point, one of the many problems I see with like capitalism is the way that we kind of regulate markets in ways that think about the public interest, but are more closed-mindedly focused on like sectoral interests in finance or Wall Street, right? And so when we're talking about investor protection, like, are we saying only people who are current or prospective equity owners, like they are the ones whose interests matter, or like do all of the rest of the people in the country whose like lives are bound up with the economic system that we live in, and how we make the most of kind of human flourishing under the conditions that we have and we can shape. That's a really tall order for me, and so that's the kind of level of generality that I think of this problem at. That like there are deep entrenched problems with how we approach what capital markets are for. And it seems that that's like not even on the radar of kind of regulatory discussion at all. So when I think about the direction of regulation in this space, I'm thinking more about how we can look forward to that kind of open-ended future of like making these systems and processes that we already have for kind of allocating capital to high social value uses work better for kind of everyone. So from that perspective, I'm very, very interested in what y'all are doing with retail investors.
Yeah, I think that's it's really funny because I often find myself explaining to people, I'm like, markets are here to serve, and maybe I don't know if you will agree or disagree with this, but it's what I've always said. So markets are here to serve two purposes: capital formation and price discovery, right? And we often lose sight of that because we've become so consumed with intermediation, and the experts in the room are always the middlemen. Right, like think back to the influence that Bernie Madoff had on regulation, because he was the expert, he was the smartest guy in the room, and now look at again who are the people influencing regulation the most. It continues to be the middlemen, the wholesalers, often the retail brokerage firms, and rarely do you have a strong voice in the room who represents investors, either retail or institutional. And I get your point of, well, what does that even mean? Which institutional, which retail investors? But that aside, even getting them in the room, it can be a struggle. And I think that the shape that our markets have taken has been so incredibly influenced by Bernie Madoff and people in similar positions, and not nearly enough by the people that markets are supposed to serve, which is public companies and investors, who are generally the last people that are consulted on market regulation.
Yeah, Bernie had no sense of greater good at all. No one would argue that. And that attitude is what's carried us into modern markets. And I see that as a regular everyday investor. There is no consideration for us, but there's, like you said, no consideration for the greater good in general. Is how is this affecting everyone? This is everyone's pensions, whether they're directly investing or not. This still affects your life. So I think if we could just implement that sense, we would already be worlds ahead from where we're at now, and we wouldn't be having as many regulation conversations as we're having. But you've got to join the table to be able to speak up for yourself. So that's why I'm really proud of We the Investors, and think that that's where all of these interests align going forward. of how to actually make that happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about who's at the table really matters. This is, I think, a follow-up conversation to an earlier one that you had with my colleague and often collaborator, Ben Edwards, who's another law professor who works on these issues, and he has a couple of projects that talk about this problem of like conflicts in the self-regulatory organization space, and actually conflicts kind of in general in intermediation as being some of the big drivers of like a misallocation of capital, right? So if, like someone gives you bad advice and it leads you to fund a project that, by kind of objective lights shouldn't be funded, then like that's bad for, whether we think markets are doing the things they're supposed to be doing. So, that's a problem that, kind of is at the core even of like the most kind of orthodox neoclassical, economics concerns about how we're doing market structure. The issue that you have, I don't want to kind of speak out of turn, but I think Madoff was at one point, like some high position at, I think, NASDAQ, right? Maybe they're
sat on the board. I think.
Yeah, right. So if we're talking about who's watching the Watchmen, right? There is this real problem that like self-regulatory organizations, if we have this nearly century-old decision to delegate rulemaking and enforcement power to self-regulatory organizations, because that's what we did back in the day, in Manhattan, and
before almost anyone had a telephone.
Right. Well, right, and on that point, not just kind of information technology changes, but the entire incentive structure of the industry. When you had a mutualized kind of nonprofit exchange regulatory model, that looked very different in terms of how they make money and the incentives to make certain kinds of rules relative to now when we have kind of a for-profit kind of public company model.
You mean publicly traded for-profit companies shouldn't be able to regulate themselves? What kind of communist talk is this?
Is this America? I don't know. Is this?
The foxes should guard the hen house, right?
Yeah, come on. But I mean, it's I've been told that all conflicts of interest can be cured through disclosure. Isn't that true?
Yes, no. So I'm being a little glib, right? So I guess there's the main problem with disclosure, which is that no one reads it, right? If you think about the last time that you clicked yes after actually reading terms and conditions, right? I more to the point, things like Form CRS in the retail kind of advisory or brokerage relationship, they have this. They're built on this model, this idea that people can both be can engage in self-help, and that probably isn't true. For most retail investors, and it also suggests that you can fully disclose in a very short period of time, and at a very important point in an advisory relationship, what the nature of sometimes potentially very complex conflicts is, and like people, I find it really hard to understand the implications of some conflicts that exist in the industry, and I do this for my living, so. So disclosure, I do think it works a little differently in the kind of retail context when we're talking about the effects of like intermediation conflicts, like with a brokerage firm or whatever, right? A firm that uses some kind of push notification to get you to trade more or something, right? Like the model of disclosure is either they send you the push notification and it says click yes to accept this push notification. You've accepted the terms and conditions and the full disclosure, right? Or it's disclosed ahead of time when you're not thinking about it. And it's like, we may make more money because we get you to trade more. And that's, who's going to act on that? It's very different from the rest of securities markets, where we think that non-readers, like people who don't actually do anything with disclosure, are still protected through like the price discovery mechanism. That doesn't exist in like markets, at least in my view, it doesn't exist in markets for intermediation in the same way that it does in like kind of very deeply liquid and informationally efficient capital markets.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. All right, well, this is an interesting conversation. I think it could go on for a while, but I'm more interested in talking about a really important topic, this Supreme Court case.
The SEC versus Jarkesy. So aside from not being able to reach a consensus on how to pronounce the name, we are kind of wondering if you could explain to us what it is, what the case involves, and explain a little bit about it, why it's important.
Yeah. So there's a funny colloquy at the oral argument in the Supreme Court where the lawyer was, like, you people keep mispronouncing it, Jarkesy, right? So it's Jarkesy. So, it remains to be seen how I will pronounce it today. But the backstory to this case is lots of federal agencies, including the SEC, have this choice in doing enforcement actions to go in the federal court route, or go an enforcement proceeding in-house before the agency's administrative law judges. We have in the securities industry kind of additional variants on that, right, where you have self-regulatory organizations which themselves have hearing officers, enforcement programs and proceedings, things like that. But the SEC uses its administrative law judges for all sorts of things, right? They do enforcement proceedings against registered firms or individuals, for violations of the securities laws that the SEC administers. If the SEC is going after some issuer, some public company that is like delinquent in its, Ks and Qs for years, right? They might go after them and seek like a deregistration of like their ability to be exchange listed, right? Or something like that, right? So, historically, that was the sort of thing we were talking about. And particularly after the Dodd-Frank Act, the SEC got extra powers and started being a bit more aggressive about going after both non-registered people, right? So folks who might be thought of as like, the aiders and abettors, or people who like caused some violation of the securities laws, but they are not themselves, a registered person.
Like Kim Kardashian.
Right. Sure. Yeah. So they go after potentially all sorts of people for, like being unregistered touts or whatever. Right. Or, not disclosing the receipt of, compensation under Securities Act Section 17. So there are all sorts of tools that the SEC can use to go after people in the markets. And sometimes those tools are not available to private entities. Right. They don't map on to what we normally let people sue for. It's like an SEC only remedy. And so this Jarkesy case is in part a challenge to, how the SEC does enforcement through its ALJ program. And a few years ago, the Supreme Court had this case, Lucia, which found that the SEC's administrative law judges were improperly appointed under, the applicable requirements of the Constitution that say that the agency head has to appoint someone who's exercising, the kind of offices of the United States, as the court found that the ALJs did. And so that coincided with this multi-prong attack on the administrative law judge in-house forum at the SEC. And we saw that kind of culminated last year in this other Supreme Court case about, whether you could go straight to federal court to challenge the constitutionality of like this whole enforcement program in-house, or whether you had to submit yourself to enforcement proceedings before the SEC and then like complain after the fact. So, the way that all shaped out then was, now you can sue, and the ALJs are, inferior officers. And so what else, if you are, defense counsel for, someone in finance who maybe has money to fight the SEC, right?
And despite being innocent until proven guilty, maybe you haven't been able to prove yourself not guilty.
Well, you raise a good point, right? So it's not the same as like a criminal proceeding, right? Where the government would have to come in and really show something terrible, right? In an SEC enforcement proceeding, the standard is I think the standard is a preponderance of the evidence, which basically means like 51%, right? And that's a very different sort of standard, both if you're facing, a hearing before a law judge, but also if you're like most people in this case, right, trying to read the tea leaves to figure out like, am I actually going to get in trouble? And if I do, like, what's my, if I go through with it, what's the sanctions going to be? What's my fine? If you're trying to figure out like, can I, settle this early for fewer kind of lesser sanctions? All of this is relevant, right? Like, whether the SEC can really go after you. So the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit that handles Texas mostly has led the charge over the last few years in challenges to the SEC's enforcement program, thinking that this kind of expansion of a relatively lower burden of proof proceeding in a forum that is perceived to be biased in favor of the SEC, right? Because like, you're in-house, why wouldn't you be biased in favor of them, right? Mm-hmm. And without all of the protections of like a court proceeding, that there's some deep constitutional problem with that. And the Fifth Circuit, which itches to find any excuse to invalidate action by a presidential administration that isn't Republican, they found multiple problems with the. I'm being maybe a little too glib about that, but like
I've been told that Democrats are the activist judges, not the
the Fifth Circuit. I'm not sure if it has any Democratic appointed judges on it at this point. It is it's a very stacked bench, but they have been very aggressive against the SEC, and so they found all these problems with the SEC in House court system, and it got before the Supreme Court, and before the new year we got an oral argument in this case where we were able to see a little bit more about what the what the Supreme Court is thinking. And I'll stop talking in just a sec, but the last thing I'll mention is what this oral argument of the case turns on is one of the three problems that the Fifth Circuit had found, like the kind of lower court of appeals before the Supreme Court had found, with the SEC's in-house judges. There were three problems. One, that there wasn't a jury available to help decide the case. That Congress had not. Second, that Congress hadn't, sufficiently delegated to the SEC how to decide whether to go to court or do it in-house. And then there was a third problem that I find a bit more arcane and technical about, whether the law judges were, impermissibly shielded from like political accountability by the possibility of being removed from office. So the oral argument mostly focused on that Seventh Amendment issue.
And this seems to me, and probably how we ended up here, that there are parallels to the Alpine Securities case against FINRA, in that it is challenging the very constitutionality of the enforcement process. That one at FINRA, this one at the SEC. Is that right?
Yeah, and the reason I mentioned, so yes, but like in broader context, the reason I mentioned, all of the other cases that have found faults with what the SEC is doing, the Supreme Court has also been pretty focused on, like disgorgement remedies at the SEC, and like how far back, without hitting up against a statute of limitations, you can try and claw back money from someone who's like kind of kept ill-gotten gains, and like whether the SEC can keep them in the Treasury or whether they have to disperse it into a fair fund or things like that, right? So there's been a lot of tinkering by the Supreme Court over the last few years about how the SEC is carrying out, its enforcement program, and I think one of the implications of this is that the SEC is just like a disfavored agency right now at the Supreme Court. And it also, the ways that the court has started talking about structure of government issues, like with respect to how we're designing, SEC enforcement, it does raise potential problems, right? Red flags for other ways that we're doing things in this industry, right? So if one of the concerns is that Congress has to, be pretty clear, and you can't just trust, those evil agency, staffers to, kind of faithfully implement Congress's, vision, then, how could we trust self-regulatory organizations to do the same thing? So you mentioned Alpine. I don't want to draw a direct line between Jarkesy, whatever it is, and
it's pronounced Jerk Store.
The Jerk Store, yeah. The Jarkesy store called. Yeah. Maybe I have to remember that like jerk chicken is really delicious, and maybe that'll help me.
Spicy.
Yeah, very very spicy. So all this is to say, I think there are going to be a lot of consequences for this set of structural attacks against the SEC for how we do regulation kind of across the industry. And the judges have not always been known to be like super great at understanding securities regulation. And so my guess is there's going to be some kind of unintended consequences for FINRA and for like DTC or whatever, right, that flow from starting to chip away at the ability of self-regulatory organizations to do this. And I should say, like, I don't mean that as a defense of the status quo, or like that I think the SROs are doing the right. I think there are real problems, as I said, with how we're doing things. But I'm not sure that I'm actually not sure how to put odds on how Alpine is going to come out.
Yeah, you will find no defense of the status quo here, that's for sure. But at least from my perspective, I tend to want to change things methodically and purposefully rather than nuking them. And a lot of our listeners totally disagree with that, and they want to nuke it all. And sure, that's an approach. I just don't know what comes out at the other end if you do that kind of thing. But maybe we're going to find out, right?
You don't tear your house down before you've started building your new one, or at least having somewhere to sleep. So, I mean,
do you have drawings of the new house?
Right.
What's it gonna look like?
Do you have a business plan for this new house? A lot of people, you run into that a lot, especially within like the communities that discuss this, is that there's just so many calls to burn it all down, to whatever term they may use. And it's just, there's no forethought as to the implications, just trying to implement some of these simple changes. You're talking about the implications running far and wide to FINRA and who knows where else. So it's, we've made this bed, and now we've sort of got to figure out, how do we unmake the bed when there are so many layers there to it? And listening in, it seems a little bit discouraging, but also hopeful to know that, Dave, just a couple of thousand comment letters have completely impressed the SEC with the fact that retail is so involved and wants these things to change and want to be a part of the conversation. So I've noticed that throughout our conversations with them, that it doesn't take much to impress them and to bring about this conversation. So it's just, I don't know. It's really, I hear James's hesitation to even put his odds out there, and it's like, wow, so nobody really knows what's going on or where this is going to go. So I just wanted to ask James, do you think we're headed in the right direction with some of these things that we're seeing, as far as trying to change the way the SROs work?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. So I think it depends in part on like how you think, everyone's got a vision of like the good world, and how are we going to get there? What's the theory of change to get you there? And I think there are, that maps onto this question of, are we going in the right direction in this reform? Because you could think of it as two ways, right? One is to better align the institutions and structures of like how we do economics and markets with like the way that we currently have our constitutional system, like with a president and a Congress, right? And like what we really want is to increase the accountability between, the regulators and the president, right? And that's one of the fights that we've been talking about with all of these court cases is, like not maybe not non-delegation, but the removal protections, right? Those are about making sure that the ALJs know who is boss, right? It's the politically accountable people. The problem with that, of course, is that if you're worried about bias, in favor of like, if you are worried as a potential enforcement, subject about facing a biased forum, like that's going to go in the opposite direction.
It could be confusing if like the standards change from administration to administration, right?
Right. And they do a little bit, but like, it sounds like
priorities change.
Yeah, the people, the whole practice changes, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the other possibilities then are to just completely reform the system, right? And I don't know that, I don't know how possible and kind of practical that is when there's very deeply entrenched kind of deep-pocketed interests around the existing kind of status quo, right? And who will fight to protect the status quo, which means then, if you don't want to align something with the president, and you don't want to maybe you can't just kind of blow it all up, right? Are there other ways of kind of getting us there? And I think that the answer, and I'm drawing here on this sociologist, Eric Olin Wright, who died a few years ago, but has this idea that like, you can resist the problems, the excesses of capitalism, right? And this might be like the kind of Elizabeth Warren model, right? Or you can smash it, which I think is a little bit of what you're talking about in terms of people being disillusioned and just like wanting to start completely fresh. And like, there's lots of people who, write very detailed plans for, how they will be in charge, like on the day after, I think the jury is out on like how the kind of revolutionary model has worked to kind of change distributions of wealth over time. But so if you don't want to just do the kind of, kind of neoliberal, just like we're going to see if we can kind of tame capital markets, right? What else do you have, right? And I think the answer has to be creating different visions of like what it means to organize economic activity, and to do so like through governance mechanisms, right? And so if you want, I'm being a little vague about this, right? But among other things, like you got to get people to participate, right? And you got to like contest, like you can't just like let market structure be captured by industry. You have to like create, propose alternatives and like be sophisticated about like, yes, there will be like higher costs associated with doing this thing, but like we have all these things that we're trying to trade off, and like investor protection, doing what investors want, crudely, right, is an important part of like how people have a say in the economic conditions that like affect their lives. And so, I think there are all sorts of models, some that are much more kind of writing agency comment letters, and others that are thinking more kind of long-term about, if you think, for instance, like some of my colleagues who work on retail investors and like proxy campaigns, right? If you think that the internet is going to make it a lot easier for people to coordinate and do shareholder voting, then like that's great. But it also means that we have to like create forums and like spaces for that.
Oh, interesting, you would say that.
Sometimes they create themselves, and sometimes
you've heard of urban finance.
I have not. I do see the little thing on the.
Thank you for describing our business model so succinctly for us.
We're going to cut this up. Thank you. Okay, so let's just, before we keep going down this path, I want to take a step back to the Jerk store and ask you, can you tell us, and I know you don't want to benchmark it, but I'm going to still make you, how do you think this is going to be decided? Or maybe how do you fear it might be decided, and what are the what are the ramifications of it, so people can really understand, at least at a higher level, why we're talking about this Supreme Court case about SEC administrative law judges?
Sure. So, the oral argument was all we can do maybe without being omnipotent or like getting a leak from the justices clerks or something like that, is to like try and read the tea leaves of oral argument. And the oral argument was mostly focused on this question of like, is it okay for the to let the government pursue certain kinds of claims against people in an agency forum, instead of in federal court. And so just like the reason I'm telling this backstory is because I think it clarifies the stakes for us. The Supreme Court has had all sorts of cases over time about whether you can let two private parties, like in kind of bankruptcy or CFTC sorts of proceedings, right? Two private parties go from court where they might have potentially access to a jury to like a federal administrative proceeding. And this case is mostly about whether agencies that are, enforcing new federal statutes, right? Stuff that's on top of the stuff that you used to be able to sue at in court, like in the colonies, right? Like that's basically the constitutional standard. Like, could you go to court to like try and vindicate this kind of claim? And if so, letting the government shift some of those claims away from court and into like an in-house agency proceeding might be seen as bad, right? It might be bad for your jury rights or whatever. So that's the stakes of this case. And I just don't know. I mean, I think it is hard to know whether there are 5 votes to completely like upend that sort of practice across all sorts of agencies, right? FERC has, kind of administrative proceedings, occupational safety and health. I think SSA has a lot of, Social Security has a lot of administrative law judges. So potentially all sorts of administrative structures that we have across the government are, potentially at play. The Supreme Court does like to say, like, we're really just talking about these guys that we don't like. Yes. And, we're keeping our government hands off your Social Security, right?
Right.
And so I don't know if they're going to find some nice little loophole so that, the constitutional objections are good only, ticket good for one ride only, to get out of, SEC jail free. We'll see whether that's the case or, but the stakes, I think, do reflect this problem across the federal government. But then, as we were discussing with Alpine, I think that how it's written will inevitably be used to bring further challenges to the SROs and things like that.
So let's say that they do decide that they do figure out how to narrowly tailor it, maybe not, but even so, are the implications then that when the SEC wants to bring an enforcement action, they're going to have to go to a federal court every time if the target of that action decides to fight? And if so, do you think that dramatically reduces the number of enforcement actions the SEC is able to bring on a regular basis?
Yeah, so the SEC is it's a resource-constrained agency, right? It's funded by appropriations in a way that the self-regulatory organizations are not, and so there are just resource constraints, right? If you tell the SEC that you want them to start doing some new program, but like you don't give them a commensurate rise in increase in resources, then they just have to make harder choices about how they're using their enforcement budget. And I do think that one of the virtues of the administrative forum is that it's easier and it's cheaper, because if you're doing a license revocation proceeding, why make a federal case out of it? Right. Like literally, why go to federal court for that other than because there's like kind of a very vague kind of ideological commitment to accountability, a particular vision of like how you do accountability through like administrative law. And if the practical reality is like you just are going to have a lower level of enforcement activity, then like I think that's also very relevant in figuring out whether these are good or bad changes to law. But it's inevitable that if they have to choose whether to go to court, it will just mean fewer cases being brought, because right now the SEC can kind of open an investigation and in a great many of its cases, just kind of proceed along something that might look like an administrative proceeding track. And, if you can get a settlement and get it through as an administrative proceeding, that's like cheaper and easier and creates certainty earlier for everyone. And if you have to go to court for that, there will just be less of it.
Yep. So that's a problem, especially when we want more enforcement and we want more deterrence. And I think that this is probably a conversation that we're going to have to pick up again, because I feel like we could keep going, but we're really running up against it. So James, I want to thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Markets. I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope everyone else has enjoyed it.
It's been great. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. Well, Pink, we've kicked off season 3. We've got these amazing new designs that you made. Happy New Year.
If it looks great, I made it. If it doesn't look great, AI generated it. So
I think it looks great, and so I'm sure everyone else does. But thanks everyone for joining us. We're really excited to kick off 2024. We got a lot of good stuff to talk about this year, and we'll be talking, I think, a lot more about court cases and SEC administrative judges and the like over the course of the year as we see how these things play out. So with that, make sure to subscribe, give us good ratings if you think we deserve it on whatever you're listening to us on, and join us next week when we're going to be talking markets on Let's Talk Markets. So we'll talk about what the new year holds for markets and where they're going, and see if we can give you some good, insightful, and interesting information.
That's right. Thanks for joining us. See you next time, guys.
Thanks, everyone.